Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to our Muslim Women Scholars Series seminar. My name is Zainab Jamal, and I'm a projects associate at CCMW. Today, we're very excited to have all of you join us, and we'll begin with the recitation of Quran in its English translation, followed by a land acknowledgement. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, most merciful. All praise is for Allah, Lord of the worlds, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Master of the day of judgment, you alone we worship and you alone we ask for help. Guide us along the straight path, the path of those you have blessed, not those you are displeased with or those who are astray. I would also like to acknowledge that this land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Piton First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was a subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Palm Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to any who may be here with us today, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Miigwech. Now, to help us stay on track, I'm going to briefly go over some housekeeping rules that we have. So first, please be respectful, and we invite your comments and questions, and we'll run a live Q&A session at the end of the seminar using the chat box and Q&A box. Please contribute to the Q&A session with an open mind and heart, and please try to use I statements. Also consider the Q&A session a dialogue, not a debate. With that being said, please practice active listening. A post-event survey will be emailed to you later today. It will take about 5 minutes to complete and will help us improve our future programs and events. Now I'm going to pass the mic to Nuzhat Jaffrey to do her welcome remarks and introduce our speaker for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Salams to you all. So we are delighted to have Dr. Naveen Rida with us again. Her seminars are among the favorites in our series of Muslim women scholars. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the series. CCMW is pleased to present the Muslim Women Scholar Series. One of our strategic goals is to promote critical thinking among Muslims and non-Muslims, to challenge stereotypes and assumptions about Islam, Muslim women, and their families. One way of doing this is to feature the work of contemporary Muslim women scholars, focusing on diverse topics related to Muslim women. And I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Naveen Rida. Naveen is Associate Professor of Muslim Studies at Emmanuel College of Victoria University and the University of Toronto. Her research interests include the poetics and hermeneutics of Quranic narrative structure, Hebrew Bible, and Quran, spiritually integrative approaches to the Quran, Islamic feminist hermeneutics, and Islamic ethical legal theory. Her publications include the Al-Baqarah Crescendo, Understanding the Quran Style, Narrative, Structure, and Running Themes, and a co-edited volume, Islamic Interpretive Tradition and Gender Justice, Processes for Canonization, Subversion, and Change. So welcome, Naveen. I'm going to pass the mic over to you now.
Thank you so much, Nuzhat, for introducing me and for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here with you today. So the topic I'm going to speak about today stems from an article or a chapter I wrote in a newly published book by Musawah. So I'll begin by telling you a little bit about Musawah for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the organization. And then I'll talk a little bit about the book before delving more deeply into the problems in usul al-fiqh methodologies and how to fix them. Today's talk is an extended version of one that I gave at the book launch at SOAS at the University of London, England, about 2.5 weeks ago. Several authors spoke at that book launch, each presenting their chapter in the book, and I think the video recordings may be available. So what is Musawah? As you can see here on the slide, if you can read what is written on the poster in the picture, Musawah is a global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. And that, of course, includes marriage. In my experience, Musawah is the most active and probably the largest Islamic feminist network today. Musawah works in 4 areas: knowledge building, capacity building, international advocacy, and communications and outreach. Their newest project in the area of knowledge building is the book I'm talking about. It's titled Justice and Beauty in Muslim Marriage, Towards Egalitarian Ethics and Laws, and you can see it here on the slide. It is edited by Ziba Mir-Hosseini, Mulki Al-Sharmani, Jana Rumminger, and Sarah Marsso. It was published late last year in 2022 by Oneworld Academic. The book is a multi-author volume. It consists of 4 parts, each with 3 chapters for a total of 12 chapters, and they are each written by different authors. As you can see on this slide from the table of contents, there are some very well-known names here, including Ziba and Mulki, of course, but also Umayma Abu Bakr, Asma al-Amrabit, Mohsen Kadivar, Sadia Sheikh, and many other names you may recognize. The 4 parts are the Quran, lessons from the Prophet, Islamic legal theory and ethics, and law and practice. My chapter is located in the 3rd part on Islamic legal theory and ethics, and it's titled Reform of Usul al-Fiqh and Marriage, a Spiritually Integrative Approach. My chapter revolves around 3 key questions. The first is, how can we realize justice and the higher ethical values in Muslim societies? Here on the slide, you can see a picture from the Arab Spring with people who are crying out for justice, among other things. Adala ijtima'iyya. Injustice and oppression is the root of so many of our problems in the Muslim world, whether economic, political, or social. Injustice is not reserved for gender relations, but it has a habit of spreading into society at the different levels, from the interpersonal level to the highest political levels and everywhere in between. I could just as easily have used a picture from Iran. We all know about the abuses and injustices going on over there. I contend that in order to have justice in Muslim societies, we need to have justice in Muslim marriage, because marriage is the most important human relationship and the key institution where values are developed and instilled, where children are raised, and where partners grow and learn together and from each other. Without justice in marriage, there can be no justice in Muslim societies, because this is really the foundation of society. Justice needs to start at home. So this leads me to my second question. How can we realize justice and the higher ethical values in Muslim marriage? Family laws, including marriage and divorce laws in most Muslim majority countries, are informed by fiqh. That is the classical medieval masculinist interpretations of Sharia. In order to reach the root of the injustices there, we need to dig deep into the methodologies of that discipline, into usul al-fiqh, ethical legal theory. So my third question, and the one I focus on in my chapter, is what are the problems in the methodologies of usul al-fiqh? How can we fix them? And what would that look like in the case of marriage? This is what I'll talk about now, and inshallah, I'll make it really easy, I hope. The problems in usul al-fiqh are of two kinds: contextual problems and principle-based problems. And by contextual problems have to do with the main schools, the main madhahibs, inability or unwillingness to make adjustments that account for the changing contexts and the emergence of the modern nation state. A great example is when it comes to the registration of marriage and divorce. Despite the harm that comes to women from unregistered marriages and divorces that are not recognized in a court of law and the loss of rights that this incurs, jurists are unwilling to change pre-modern constructions of marriage and divorce to include registration. Here in Canada, many Muslim scholars conceptualize marriage as a type of sacrament that is similar to a religious ceremony or ritual that is under the control of ordained religious clergy or elite and not controlled by the state. So Muslim clergy-like figures give themselves the religious authority to pronounce someone married or divorced. They seem unaware that we are not supposed to have priests or rabbis in Islam, and that marriage is in the classical tradition is actually conceptualized as a civil contract. So it is really the community or the state that gets to pronounce someone married or divorced, and not religious higher-ups. In the Quran and even Sunnah, the Muslim community is envisioned as an egalitarian community. We don't have priests or rabbis or other ordained elite. We are supposed to be all alike like the teeth of a comb. Being unable to deal with the profound changes in society and the legal systems and the importance of registering marriages and divorces, these are all contextual problems. Our classical madhahib, our various different schools of ethical legal reasoning, have failed to develop their fiqh and their methodologies in ways that achieve the Quran's ethical directives of justice and beauty, adl and ihsan, in the contemporary context. Principle-based problems have to do with four main principles of ethical legal reasoning: the Quran, the Sunnah, consensus, and reason. On the screen here, you can see a table that briefly summarizes the main problems in these four principles and also solutions that I have proposed. I'll start with the Quran. When it comes to the Quran, there are two main problems. First, only about 5% of verses are actually used in jurisprudence, ethical legal reasoning, and the rest are ignored. The verses that are taken into consideration are called ayat al-ahkam, verses with rulings, and they generally come in the form of commands and prohibitions, while stories, for example, are usually disregarded. The second problem has to do with interpretations that don't always fit the literal text of what the Quran is actually saying, and that are atomistic. So they look at the Quran in little bits at a time, often without looking at what the surrounding bits and verses say. The solution is what I'm calling a spiritually integrative approach, and it stems from studying the organization of the Quran. Here I argue that we need to take 100% of the Quran into consideration, connecting between its practical and spiritual dimensions, since the instruction, prohibitions, stories, and theological reflections are all connected and contribute to shaping meaning. The Quran is a very well-organized book in the form of a pathway or spiritual method that takes people from the lowest self, called an-nafs al-ammara bis-su', the self that incites to bad things, moving on to the next level of self, the self-critical self that takes responsibility for its own actions, and nafs al-lawama, it's called in Arabic, and so on until the self reaches completion. Every surah is a step in this process of spiritual advancement. I'm going to show how that plays out using divorce as an example. I'll briefly show the progress of ideas in the Quran. The Quran begins with al-Fatiha, the opening surah, that is surah number 1, which establishes the connection to God and affirms faith foundations established by previous prophets and faith traditions. You can see that here on the slide, the surah numbers are on the left-hand side in green, and on the right, you have a brief description of what the surah is about. Surah 2 is Surah Al-Baqarah, and it is about the covenant, our covenant with God, in Arabic, mithaq or ahd. All the beliefs and practices of the emerging faith tradition have their beginnings in this surah, which incidentally also happens to be the largest, the longest surah. Here too, one finds the foundations for marriage and divorce. So what does the surah have to say about divorce? It speaks of a kind of initial separation, ila, that precedes divorce, talaq, and it sets a maximum for it of 4 months so as not to keep the wife hanging. It delineates a waiting period, idda, for divorce, which is 3 menstrual cycles. It opens up possibilities for amicable reconciliation during the waiting period, especially if the wife turns out to be pregnant. It sets limits to divorce. Only 3 divorces are allowed before the divorce is final, so as not to prolong the waiting period and thereby harm women. The ex-husband may not take back anything he previously gave to the wife, unless they both agree that it is unfair to the husband and the community ratifies that agreement. The final release, or letting go, or tasrih, is with ihsan, beauty, kindness, going above and beyond the minimum. And of course, the surah also says that divorced women have a right to a financial settlement from their husbands. These are the most important foundations for divorce as they occur in Surah Al-Baqarah. Every surah after Surah Al-Baqarah picks up on an idea from Al-Baqarah and elaborates it in order of priority. The next surah is Surah 3, Ali Imran, the family of Imran. And it is about the components of the Shahada, the testimony of faith. It elaborates on the importance of the oneness of God and following God's prophets and messengers. Surah 4 is all about justice in interpersonal relationships within the same community. That's Surah An-Nisa, women. It builds on previous surahs and raises the bar when it comes to ethics in the community. Since marriage is such an important relationship, there's a lot about marriage in this surah. It adds 2 things to the basic foundations in Surah Al-Baqarah. First, it identifies marriage as both a covenant and a contract. It uses both these words in relation to marriage. Second, it identifies 3 diseases of marriage, scenarios that make for toxic marriages. Polygamy is the first of these toxic situations. The second is imprisoning women in their homes and not allowing them out except with the permission of their husbands. And the third is wife beating. The surah also provides ethical intervention strategies to help the nafs, the self, the person, the abusive husband, to overcome these awful diseases. And these strategies are all about justice, giving an in-depth treatment of justice and teaching about different aspects and manifestations of justice. I have spoken about the polygamy verse and the wife-beating verse before at CCMW events, so I'll just recap some of their main highlights. The polygamy verse, which is verse 4.3, teaches the careful weighing between 2 different terms for justice, qist and adl. Qist means equity or social justice, and it means to give vulnerable people who are affected by personal or structural disadvantages a little bit more so they can achieve equality in society. For example, widows and orphans. Adl means justice in the sense of equality. One could say that qist is a jamal quality, so a form of justice that incorporates compassion. Al-Muqsit is a divine name, a name for God that stems from that beautiful word qist, or equity. Al-Adl, the just, is also a name of God, but it is a Jalal name, so a name of majesty. It has strength and nuances of absoluteness. It is justice in the absolute sense. Like the polygamy verse, the beating verse, or the so-called beating verse, verse 434, also teaches about justice, and it uses it as an ethical intervention strategy to combat wife beating. From this verse, one can learn that without justice and compassion, aspirations for highness and greatness can turn into oppression and injustice, as in the case of wife beating. At the spiritual level, justice is important because it helps balance Jamal, so that's names of beauty, divine names of beauty, and Jalal, divine names of majesty. One of the things that our tradition teaches when it comes to spiritual advancement is the manifestation of divine names needs to be balanced, and this surah helps provide a framework for that balance to happen. I have spoken about not too sure if I've spoken about verse 415 before at a CCMW event, at least not in great detail. But what it does is it teaches that men should not lock up women in their homes and try to hamper their mobility and their ability to leave the house. It addresses the inner fear that men may have, since many men who do that either fear that their wives are going to cheat on them, or they justify it in this way. What this verse teaches is the presumption of innocence, that one cannot punish women or anyone else for crimes they have not committed and for which they have not been convicted. So it teaches the presumption of innocence in interpersonal relationships, which is a big thing and quite revolutionary in this context. This is another important principle that one needs to learn if one wants to be just. There's more. When it comes to divorce, the surah identifies 3 stages for an ethical divorce, and it uses 3 different terms for them. The first is nushuz, which is spousal separation, where one partner leaves the marital home with the intention possibly of separating. And I've spoken about that term before at a previous CCMW event. The second is shiqaq, which is a split or a break in the marriage covenant. And the third is the final parting of ways, firaq, which is by mutual consent. Marriage is considered a very strong bond in the Quran. It is described as a firm covenant, mithaq ghalidh. The only other relationship that is described as a mithaq ghalidh in the Quran is our relationship with God. So divorce should not be easy. It should not be a spur of the moment thing, but it should take time. And this surah teaches us about the 3 stages of the breakdown of a marriage and provides opportunities for reconciliation along the way. It's really a fabulous surah, subhanAllah. Let's take a look at where these different terms occur in the surah. Nushuz occurs in 434, which I just mentioned, the so-called beating verse, and the fact that it speaks of women's nushuz indicates that women have the right to initiate separation, to initiate nushuz. It's taken for granted here. So to leave their husband and reside somewhere else as the first step in an ethical divorce. The surah also speaks of men's nushuz. So men can also do nushuz. They can leave the marital home and go live somewhere else as the first step in an ethical divorce. Both partners have the right to initiate a divorce. In both cases, the surah suggests strategies to help keep the couple together. Shiqaq is a split or a break in the covenantal relationship. And we can see that word used in other contexts where it speaks about a break in other types of covenants. And that particular split, the surah describes it as a split between them. So this is both-sided. It's not one partner initiating shiqaq. This is a development that happens when reconciliation is not successful in the stage of nushuz. Here too, as we can see in the verse, the surah counsels reconciliation. It suggests two arbiters to try and resolve the problems that the couple are unable to resolve on their own. And here in verse 4:130, we see the third of these terms, firaq, the final parting of ways. And here too, it is both of them who take that action together. The Arabic, it says, وَإِنْ يَتَفَرَّقَا. If the two of them part ways, God will provide for each of them from God's bounty. So firaq here is by mutual consent. Both part ways after reconciliation efforts fail. As we can see, divorce is not a male-only prerogative that he can exercise upon his wife without any input from her, sometimes even irrevocably in one sitting. That is not what the surah is saying here, at least not my understanding of it. Divorce is a process with opportunities to help mend the marriage along the way, and the final parting of ways should be by mutual consent. Women have just as much right to initiate the process of divorce as men, and there's a lot of evidence for that. Classical constructions of marriage and divorce are very different from the ones I develop in this spiritually integrative approach in this particular book chapter. Based on this reading of the Quran, I define marriage as a civil contract with financial and sexual implications and a covenant for spiritual advancement. And that's very important. Its contractual aspects are justiciable in a court of law, while its spiritual aspects are not. However, the law serves to regulate marriage in ways that best serve this spiritual purpose and achieve equity and justice. This is a very different conceptualization from the classical one of the husband paying maintenance in return for a wife's sexual availability, which is based on the contract of sale or slavery model. The classical model has a lot of problems built into it and runs contrary to the Quran, which I won't get into now. When it comes to divorce, the two conceptualizations are also very different. In the classical construction, divorce is defined as a male-only right that he can exercise without the wife's input or permission, sometimes even irrevocably in one sitting. And there really is no basis for this definition other than a desire for masculinist privilege. Women were not involved in this construction. In classical fiqh, men can remarry in the waiting period, even without the soon-to-be ex-wife's permission. In the spiritually integrative approach, women have equal rights to divorce their husband, even if the husband is unwilling. An ethical divorce is a three-stage process with opportunities for reconciliation, and the final parting of ways is by mutual consent. Men cannot remarry until the divorce is final. So as you can see here, the methodology I describe in this chapter depends on a close reading of the Quran and its distinctive terminology, and it approaches the Quran as a well-organized text. This distinctive, spiritually integrative approach is what I'm proposing as a solution to the methodological problems in interpreting the Quran. The second main principle of usul al-fiqh, Islamic ethical legal reasoning, is the sunnah or hadith, which are the texts that we associate with the Prophet Muhammad's sunnah or tradition. Hadith are brief reports that tell us about something the Prophet said or did. Here again, there are two main problems. The first is the relationship between the Quran and the Sunnah. The Sunnah is often privileged over and above the Quran and can even overrule it. As-Sunnah qadiya ala al-Qur'ani wa nasikha lah. The Sunnah is considered a judge over the Quran and can abrogate it. The second problem has to do with hadith interpretation. Hadith tend to be very short, cryptic statements that can have many meanings, and the methodologies for their interpretation tend to be very opaque or even non-existent. So we don't all, the methodologies of hadith interpretation tend to be incredibly problematic or even not there. I'm going to give you an example. We probably all know the hadith. Sabrine, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. I'm going to, we probably all know the hadith, and you can see it here on the slide in bold at the bottom. I have not left a trial, a temptation, or fitna more harmful to men than women. So this hadith, this fitna hadith, has caused so much pain and heartache and is at the root of many of the oppressions we face, especially when it comes to the mosque or participation in public life. The problem here is in how the word fitna is interpreted. Our male scholarly elite interpret it to mean sexual temptresses. They claim that women tempt men sexually, so they must therefore be locked up or controlled or not let out of the house, in some of the classical writings, except with permission of their men folks. Women's bodies are thereby placed under the control of men. However, if you look at the Quran, the word fitna and its derivatives occur 60 times. So that problematic word we see in the Quran 60 times. And not once does it occur in a sexual sense or in connection to women, not once. But it does occur in connection with oppression. For example, in connection with Moses and his people when they were an oppressed minority, and they prayed to God not to make them a temptation as objects of oppression for unjust folks. If we go by how the word occurs in the Quran, then that hadith would have an entirely different meaning with very different implications. It would mean that the Prophet feared that men would be tempted to oppress women, and that therefore the community has to be vigilant to ensure justice and equality for women, and that their rights aren't diminished, which is actually what happened historically. So if the Prophet really had said that hadith, and there are doubts, then what would he have meant by it? Would he have meant the meaning that we find in the Quran, and that is in keeping with Quranic values of justice and beauty? Or would he have meant the meaning that emerged later and that made of women second-class citizens, at least in the public space? Which is closer to the time frame of the Prophet, the Quran, or the opinions of these jurists who have issues with women? As we can see, we really need to pay attention when it comes to the interpretive methodologies of hadith, because they're a mess. The third principle of usul al-fiqh is consensus, or ijma' in Arabic. This is really the main tool that contributes to rigidity in Islamic ethical legal reasoning, and the continuation of oppressive rulings, even when they don't make any sense. Many have written about its problems. I'm just going to mention a couple of them here. First, it is difficult to prove. And second, when we look at occurrences of the word ijma' in the Quran in the same root and form, they are all negative. The word only occurs 4 times, once in connection with Noah's people coming to a consensus against him, once in connection with Pharaoh's magicians coming to a consensus against Moses, and twice in connection with Joseph's brothers who came to a consensus to throw him into a well. Let's take a look at these occurrences. So in Surah Yusuf, we see the word occur, Surah Yunus, we see the word occur in verse 71. It's in the story of Noah, and the verse says here, according to the translation that I have, recite to them the news of Noah when he said to his people, "My people, if my stay here and my reminding you of God's verses has become too much for you, then I put my trust in God. Come to a consensus, ajmi'u, on your course of action, together with your partner gods, ensuring that your course of action is clear. Then pass judgment upon me and do not postpone. So here you see that word occur. That's the first occurrence in the Quran. And then you see two more in the story of Joseph. And it's also similarly negative because you see it in the context of Joseph's brothers coming to a consensus to throw their little brother into a pit. And that's what you actually see here. So they come to a consensus to do harm to their little brother, to try and get rid of him. And then in the next surah, in Surah Taha, we see it occur in the story of Moses. And here too, it's the magicians, Pharaoh's magicians, who come to a consensus against Moses. So there are two sides here. Moses is on one side and Pharaoh's magicians are on the other, and they come to a consensus. And you see that here. They tell each other, come to a consensus, ajmi'u, on your stratagems and advance in a single line. So these are the only occurrences of the word ijma' in the Quran in the same root and form. As we can see, every time that word occurs in the Quran, it is negative, and in connection with a powerful majority trying to bully a minority or a lone voice that is standing up for the truth. And that's also often how we see it happen today, how it is used sometimes today. Not always, but sometimes. I've chosen to replace consensus or ijma' with a new principle, shura, consultation, which is positively depicted in the Quran. There is also a movement underway to have shura councils where collective ijtihad, ethical legal reasoning, takes place. This is a new phenomenon, and shura is already being actualized in these settings. So again, this particular discipline, fiqh or sharia, is an incredibly dynamic discipline, and you see changes happening with these shura councils, which is really a great development. The fourth principle is that of reason. There are many wonderful tools that the Islamic tradition has come up with in terms of ethical legal reasoning. Here too, I introduce a new one called isti'adal, seeking justice, which is based on the sophisticated Quranic notions of equity and equality and the weighing between them that I've hinted at when I spoke about Surah An-Nisa. There's no independent principle that ensures justice in ethical legal rulings in usul al-fiqh at all, which is why justice is such a rare occurrence when it comes to marriage and divorce laws within Muslim societies. So we really do need a tool to ensure justice in fiqh. And this is what I have come up with in this particular new methodology. These are very briefly the four main principles of this new methodology that I'm proposing. They build on the old ones, but make significant changes. And again, many scholars before me contribute and change and come up with new ideas. This is not unusual in the Islamic tradition. This new spiritually integrative methodology of usul al-fiqh can lead to new egalitarian constructions of marriage and divorce, as I elaborate in my chapter in the book. So thank you very much for listening, and please feel free to ask questions. Thank you. Sabrine, do you want to stop sharing?
Yes, I will do that now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent presentation. It is now time for the Q&A session. Let me just take a look at the Q&A. Okay, so this is the time to ask your questions. I'm taking a look at the chat box, and I don't see any questions yet. So to all the participants, if you have any questions at all, now is your chance to ask them in either the Q&A chat box or the chat box itself.
Even if anything was unclear, if you'd like me to explain something a little bit more, please feel free to ask. I know it's a lot.
So we have one question, and the question is, can you clarify why the 3-second divorce gains such frequency?
Ooh, why? I have no idea why. The thing is, we are not all at the same level, and humanity isn't always at the same level. From what I can see, there is an ethical progression that we see in the Quran. We start with foundations, and then we build and fine-tune our practices and our ethics as we continue in the Quran. And that also happens when it comes to humanity. So I think this 3-second divorce that you're talking about, where a man can just tell his wife, you're divorced, and that's it. Sometimes even irrevocably, and doesn't matter if there are children or not. So I think this is something that came up in the tradition, and it hasn't been revisited enough. It hasn't been examined enough. So we really do need to pay more attention to it. The problem is that most of our fiqh was constructed by men without any input from women, or rarely any input from women. And what we see in the Quran, what it teaches us is that male believers and female believers are each other's allies. They enjoin good, they prohibit harm, and it also so there really should be conversations going on. There should be back and forth, and this did not happen in the classical tradition when it comes to fiqh. We don't have evidence of that. There are a few faqihat, but very, very few. And I haven't found a single woman when it comes to usul al-fiqh.
Thank you, Naveen. We have a question from an anonymous attendee. The question is, why are men allowed to marry Islamically while they are in the process of divorce in Canada?
Okay. Right. Again, we may have different definitions of what Islamically means. If you go by the classical madhahib, they do allow that, which I don't think makes any sense at all, because the waiting period is precisely for reconciliation purposes. If there's a pregnancy, for example, it really, marriage during the waiting period isn't final. So for a man to go ahead and marry, he's actually saying, you know what, I don't care. I'm not going to give time, So it is a problem. It is a problem that this is actually allowed within Canada. Again, our fiqh really needs to be revised. We do need to sit together and discuss these issues, look at the texts, look at the Quran, look at the hadith, look at, new interpretive methodologies that make more sense, and discuss these things, because this really shouldn't be happening in Canada. It's unethical and it's not right.
Thank you, Naveen. Another question reads, what is the difference between fiqh, shura, and qisas?
Okay, thank you. So fiqh, that is the interpretation of Sharia. So Sharia is divine law. It's God's law as we see it in the Quran. And but again, it needs to be interpreted because we may misunderstand things. Or so fiqh is that human interpretation of divine law. Shura means consultation. So shura means that people sit together and consult and bounce ideas in order to come up with a decision. And that's the kind of thing that happens today in fiqh councils. So they sit down and deliberate upon new issues that may come up, like, for example, in vitro fertilization. Qisas means let me see if I can translate this. I'll explain it in English. So qisas means like retaliation. So if someone murders someone, then they get murdered in return, or sorry, they get killed in return. So that's called qisas. So it's like an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's what qisas means. And you do get that in the Quran. There is capital punishment in Surah Al-Baqarah. Again, the Quran takes a very firm view of murder, but again, there's a lot of kindness and a lot of room for not executing the murderer. But it depends on the family, and if the family forgive or if they don't, it's totally up to the family in this particular instant.
Thank you, Naveen. We have another question that says, could you please mention the rights and obligations for both men and women?
Oh, again, that's a lot. I'm not too sure I'll be able to mention all the rights and obligations of men and women. Some are the same, prayer, fasting, treating each other kindly. So there's a lot that when it comes to marriage, there are differences, and it has to do with the mahr. It has to do with the nafaqah, so that's the bride gift and maintenance. So there are some differences, but there are also a lot of similarities. If you read my chapter in the book, I go a little bit more into that. But again, one chapter or even a few minutes is not enough to explain all the rights and obligations of men and women.
Thank you, Naveen.
Yeah, let me just add one thing. Marriage is an incredibly important institution. It's an incredibly important relationship in the Quran. And it's the most important relationship that can help people grow spiritually. It's why it's called a firm covenant in the Quran. So it's not something that's to be taken lightly. It's something to be treasured and to be nurtured.
Thank you, Naveen. We have a question by Hassan in the Q&A section. And he asks, you cited all the verses against ijma, except the verse used by Imam Shafi as proof of the idea. Quran 4:115, whoever takes away other than that of the believers shall be cast in hell. All the verses about consensus you cited were about disbelievers, whereas this verse explicitly sanctions the consensus of the believers and equates straying from it with defying the messenger.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking this question. So I've actually written on that particular verse, and certainly I'm not going to be talking about, examining and studying consensus and analyzing it without looking at the proof text. And this is definitely the most important one. You see Shafi'i mentions it, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali mentions it in al-Mustasfa min ilm al-usul. You even see al-Qadi Abd al-Jabbar mentioning it in al-Mughni min abwab al-Tawheed wal-Adl. So it is the most important verse that is cited in support of consensus, ijma'. It does not have the term ijma' in it. So that word, ajma'a yujmi'u al-ijma', the root and the form does not occur. However, in terms of meaning, and I think it's important for us to unpack that meaning, this is actually that it is used as an argument for ijma' is actually a methodological problem. If you follow the best method of interpreting the Quran, this is actually a verse that is against ijma', not for it. And I'm going to explain to you why. And it all has to do with how do we interpret Sabil al-Mu'minin, the way of the believers, in this verse. So usually people who do use this verse as an argument for ijma, they identify the ijma with the way of the believers with the ijma, and usually it's the ijma of scholars, ijma al-ulama, and sometimes it's ijma ahl al-hal wal-aqd, so influential scholars or scholars with certain credentials. So, however, if you look at the Quran and how the Quran explains the way of the believers, Sabil al-Mu'minin, if you look Ali Imran, there is a passage that speaks of believers in conversation with Ahl al-Kitab, in conversation with the people of the book. And it identifies believers as those who worship God and God alone, don't take up partners with God. And here's the important piece, that we do not make of each other arbab, rabbis other than God. If you look at what are arbab in the Quran, and how did the Prophet explain that particular word? There's a hadith by a Sahabi, a companion of the Prophet called Adi ibn Hatim al-Ta'i, and he entered upon the Prophet, peace be upon him, and when the Prophet was reciting another verse that also speaks about arbab, and the verse spoke negatively. It was critiquing how people of the book made of their scholars rabbis, and so or an elite, a religious elite. Again, the Islamic tradition tends to have a very egalitarian view of the community, and so what happened was Adi ibn Hatim al-Ta'i was Christian, and so he told the Prophet, we never did this. We didn't make of our priests and rabbis and religious elite arbab. We didn't take them up as authorities. And the Prophet told him, no, you did. You let them make what is halal haram and what is haram halal, and that is your worship of them. So the word arbab, as we see in this hadith, and also as we know historically, refers to a religious elite that has the authority to make law. So these are the fuqaha, the folks who are ethical legal specialists. So from what we can see in this verse is that the way of the believers, the way of Muslims, is not to make a two-tiered distinction where one group have religious authority when it comes to law and ethics and the other group doesn't. So if we look at consensus as the consensus of a scholarly elite, and they have the power and the right and the authority to to produce and define religious law, then that's going against this verse. So that is not Sabil al-Mu'minin. To have a consensus of elite scholars, that is not Sabil al-Mu'minin. That is not the way of the believers. So I hope that made sense to you. If it hasn't, please feel free to contact me. And I have written about this, and I can help explain it more. It is a complicated concept, but again, it has to do with methodology. How do we interpret the verse that you're referring to in Surah An-Nisa? Do we interpret it using the best methodology, which is tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran, interpreting the Quran by other verses in the Quran, or do we just interpret it in whatever way we like? So this is really the issue here. If you follow the appropriate methodology, then this is not a verse that supports ijma al-ulama, the consensus of scholars. It's an argument against it. But thank you for asking that question. It's a very important question, and it really shows your knowledge of the tradition. Thank you for bringing it up.
Thank you, Naveen. And I hope I'm not putting too many questions on you. If you want a break, just let me know.
No, that's fine.
The next question. Thank you. The next question reads, what does Quran say about men being the head of the family?
Oh, okay. The Quran says, الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله به بعضهم على بعض وبما ينفقون من أموالهم. So the word قوامون is often interpreted as men being in charge of women and having the right to discipline them and things like that. What this verse actually says is that what this word qawamun actually means, if you follow an appropriate methodology, is it means it means spending, providing. So are men the head of the family? They do have a larger responsibility, that's for sure, than women, although women have a responsibility as well. I like to look at marriage as a partnership, not as a hierarchy. So I don't think the notion of a hierarchy works very well in marriage, but both partners, you know, the Quran describes the relationship between both partners as mawadda wa rahma, love and liking and sympathy and kindness and mercy and compassion. So this is really the basis and the foundation for a marriage relationship, not a hierarchy where someone gets to order the other person around. But do men have a greater responsibility? Yes, they do. In the Quran, they have a greater financial responsibility.
Thank you, Naveen. The next question reads, what does Islam say about the rights and boundaries for the in-laws, specifically the woman's or the girl's in-laws?
Oh, okay. That's the really wonderful thing about fiqh or about Sharia is that it's case-based ethical legal reasoning. So one really has to look at the situation involved, because in any ethical reasoning in any situation, there are different multiple competing imperatives at work. So there may be multiple factors at work. But in general, one of the most important principles that we see from fiqh, from Sharia, it's a beautiful principle, and it's one of the rational principles. It stems from a hadith called La darara wa la dirar fil Islam. Harm is neither inflicted nor reciprocated in Islam. So it all depends on the situation. If this is harmful to the wife, and very often it is harmful, then it might be a better solution to live apart. But again, there are different factors at work. The well-being of the in-laws might also be a factor, especially if someone isn't well, if there are financial issues at stake, but definitely privacy, especially in the early stages of marriage, tends to be a good thing for the success of a marriage and its continuation. But again, it all depends on the case, and it's a good thing to work things out together.
Thank you kindly, Naveen. We have another question that reads, does ijma imply ganging up rather than consensus? That seems to be how it is used in the Quran.
Again, I'm looking at the word itself. So the actual Arabic term ijma, yujmi'u al-ijma, in the Quran. It is a form of ganging up, but it's more comprehensive than that. So it's the agreement of the entire group on something. Maybe even after deliberation. So talking together, coming to an agreement together. So this is what that word means in the Quran. I don't know why the only occurrences of that word in the Quran are negative, but there aren't any others. I mean, I've checked very thoroughly. So the form 4 of Jin Mim Ain, of that particular root, it doesn't occur except in those 4 verses that I've come. I don't know why, but again, God has a reason. God, the Quran is incredibly wise and deep. again, it is portrayed negatively. And I think what it does is it gives people the courage to stand up against a powerful group. We see it in Noah. I mean, he had the courage to stand up to his family and his tribe and his group, and he stood up for the truth. We see it in Joseph as well, and we see it in Moses as well, who stood up against Pharaoh's magicians. So these stories, they give consolation in hardship and support and encouragement, not to be afraid to speak up and say the truth that one knows. And that's what I love about them. And also how they implicitly critique ijma, which today is used to argue for continuing injustices against women, like, for example, the 3-second divorce that we see, without going through attempts to reconcile partners.
Thank you. This question seems a little redundant, but I'm going to ask it just in case you have something to add. And it reads, what is the main expectations for men and women for each other?
Again, we see that beautiful word, ma'ruf and ihsan, these beautiful words to describe that relationship. Ma'ruf, what is known to be good. Ihsan means beauty, but it means goodness and kindness and doing the best one can, going above and beyond. So that's ihsan. We see mawadda and rahma and compassion and mercy, love, sympathy. So these are the things one can expect from a marriage. Everything that is good. One can expect loyalty, devotion. One should expect also fairness and support. So there's so much one can expect and should expect also. But again, forgiveness is also one of those qualities that we learn in marriage.
Thank you kindly.
People fall short, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So we have another question that reads, may you please revisit the verse from Surah Al-Nisa that speaks of striking of a woman. It's referenced a lot in justifying physical abuse of women, and I really struggle to understand this verse.
Oh, thank you for bringing it up. I actually last year I spoke about that verse at the CCMW event. So I'm just going to briefly say what I've done with this verse. So I've used, again, this same approach that I spoke briefly about today, which is the spiritually integrative approach. And what I mean by that, I connect between the various parts of the Quran, between the practice and the spirituality and the spiritual goals that we're trying to reach, which the Quran helps us achieve. So what you see in this verse is actually a program, a comprehensive or a multi-pronged program to combat and put a stop to domestic violence. At least in my reading, and I've written about that, and I've spoken about that last year as well. So what it does is it provides what I call, positive intervention strategies that are composed of instilling good behaviors, and negative intervention strategies, which are composed of prohibitions. So فإن أطعنكم فلا تبغوا عليهن سبيلا. So do not oppress them in any way, for example. That's one of the sentences here. So the thing is, in the 7th century, domestic violence and mistreatment of women was a widespread thing. And it's very hard for people who are at the animal level, what we would call an-nafs al-ammara bis-su, that animal self level, to reach higher practices and higher understandings of ethics without a little bit of help. And that's what the surah provides. It provides certain strategies to help people understand and give them tools in their hands by which they can rise up above domestic violence and learn why and this is wrong and how to overcome this particular practice. That's in my interpretation of it. And again, we can talk a lot more about this, and it does deserve to be unpacked piece by piece, but I already did that last year. So sorry, I'm not going to get into it in too much detail, but the recording does exist. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I've also have an article on that verse.
Thank you so much, Naveen. There's one question that I'm trying to articulate. It reads, why do people request a divorce if they know the rights, obligations, and expectations? Which may be confusing, but I thought I'd take a shot just in case you had anything.
So why do people request a divorce? Why do people divorce? Again, divorce is one of those things that God has allowed. It's the thing that God hates most, according to our tradition, but it is allowed because sometimes marriages just don't work out. And there are 3 toxic scenarios where marriages don't do their job, according to Surah An-Nisa. And in these situations, separating might be the best. One is infidelity or polygamy. The other is if a controlling husband wants to try and lock up his wife and not let her out of the house. And the third is domestic violence. So these are instances in which marriage doesn't do the job that it's supposed to, which is help partners grow on the spiritual path. So in these instances, sometimes people may choose to divorce, and sometimes that can be the best solution to safeguard the mental health and safety of marriage partners. So why do people ask for a divorce? Again, it does differ from case to case. But if there's no good reason, if there's no harm that's being done, you know, it's a great institution to stick to and to try and work things out.
Thank you. This may be the final question. This question reads, why do people request a divorce from an imam if they can divorce with mutual consent?
Okay. I actually don't understand this whole notion of why an imam needs to be involved in issuing a divorce. The problem has to do with, unfortunately, some Muslim majority countries that don't recognize Canadian courts' divorce, and they require that. And it's really very unfortunate, because really we don't have ordained clergy in the Islamic tradition, or at least most of us don't. In theory, we're not supposed to have ordained clergy. So nobody really has that right to issue a divorce unless they're a state, community appointed, a state appointed authority. So some people do want to go to an imam for a divorce. I find it unnecessary, but again, it does vary from case to case. It may be the family wants it, the community, the friends. There may be peer pressure to go that particular route, and it also may have to do with recognizing a divorce in a different country.
Thank you so much. I don't see any other questions, so I think I could pass it along now to Nazhat for the closing remarks. Thank you again, Dr. Naveen.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's really always a pleasure to be here at CCMW events.
So that was pretty amazing, Naveen. Thank you so much. I learned a lot as usual. I learned so much from your seminars. And, you know, every time we attend one of these, I have more questions. And hopefully, inshallah, you'll be back for another seminar and presentation on these topics, because, you know, these are recurring. So what's interesting is all the things that we just discussed, those are the types of issues and questions Sabrine deals with on a daily basis. And in fact, we have Imam Dr. Abdul Hai Patel here, whom we call upon often because people want a religious divorce, you know, and he actually has a page or two explaining, you know, about that, I think, because over and over again, we have to explain that you don't need a Muslim marriage or a Muslim divorce, you know, because of what you just explained, you know, the covenant and the contract, you know, and even with the contract, you need witnesses, you know, and it's a contract between the two people, it's a covenant between the two individuals, and a lot of people don't accept it or understand it. So I think maybe one last question from me before I close. When people contact us, one of the biggest challenges that we have is that, you know, we have published documents that explain the rights of men and women for marriage, for instance, and the distinctions between, you know, family laws here in Canada and Muslim family law. And even with that, people insist that they need a religious authority to pronounce something, you know, to pronounce the divorce or the marriage. And so we can explain all we want, you know, that you don't really need that religious divorce to, you know, if you get a legal divorce, first of all, you're better protected if you get a legal divorce, you know, because there are certain obligations you have to meet in a civil divorce. Anyway, so we have this constantly happening, and it's forever challenging for us to explain. And I think it's because it is very complicated for, you know, an everyday person to make that distinction, you know, between what you had in the first column and that spiritually integrative approach, because we are not that sophisticated thinkers, you know, to think through these issues the way you have explained them. And I'm sure after we leave today, we'll retain some of it, but my goodness, we'll forget half of it. The good news is that your session is being recorded, and your previous presentations are also recorded and available on our website. So again, thank you for your generosity and with your time and your knowledge. I'm, you know, thrilled that you were able to make it again today. We're grateful to you. So come back again soon, and we are going to, we're definitely going to have a book talk or an event around the book itself, because the other speakers as well as yourself can participate in a more fulsome conversation about beauty and justice in marriage. So before I go, I've been asked to remind everyone about our post-event feedback survey. You will be receiving, so there's we are sharing a link to the survey here, but we will also send it to you via email. And so please, we love your feedback from these sessions so we can improve on them for the next time. But I don't know how you can actually improve on what we just heard from Naveen. So once again, thank you. And I want to thank our team as well. Zainab, who has been working behind the scenes to make this happen. She took care of all of our invitations and logistics and so on. So thank you, Zainab. And Sabrine for advancing the slides and managing the Q&A. And to all of our participants today, all of our audience for attending. And thank you so much. And inshallah, we'll see you the next time at our Muslim Women Scholar Series. And also some of the events in between. And in the meantime, we wish you a very, very beneficial and fruitful and peaceful Ramadan. And may you be blessed, and may your prayers and your worship be accepted. Amin.